I've discovered that I enjoy exploring the meanings of words. Now, I don't enjoy reading the dictionary. Only really smart people do that. What I mean is, I enjoy looking at a single simple word that is commonly used. I look at the word over several days and consider the possible definitions. I look at different sources. I look at the root of the word. I look at what other people have said about the word. Then I try to formulate a definition of that word and what it means for me. I engage in this practice frequently when I'm preparing to teach a class or to preach as I am today. One word I've considered over the past few days is fear. What is fear? Fear is the feeling you get when you're at a consignment sale on a Thursday afternoon and thinking about how relaxed of a weekend you're going to have, and you get a text message from your senior pastor that says, "You're preaching on Sunday." It's terrifying. It'll cause your bones to shake. Fear is the feeling you get when you stand up to preach and you see hundreds of faces looking back at you, wanting you to say something that matters about a day when almost everyone was speechless, a day when words failed us. Oftentimes, the task of the preacher is to speak when everyone else is silent. It's a task to be taken seriously and prayerfully. What is fear? Fear is a feeling. It's a feeling or emotional response we have when we sense danger, serious injury, or encounter something that threatens the way we live our lives. Fear causes the heart to skip a beat, and then it begins to race. It causes the body to tighten up. It causes us to sweat. The body begins to prioritize the functions that will prepare us to run away or to stay and fight. It also slows rational thinking. When we experience fear, we don't think normally. Because we aren't thinking normally, we don't behave normally. We don't behave normally because fear grips us and chains us to itself and won't let us go. It's important to note that fear is not always a bad thing. Remember, fear is an emotion. Emotions aren't good or bad. It's how we respond to that fear that can be good or bad. Fear can, however, wear us down to a point that we no longer respond in the best ways. Untrained and unchecked, fear can cause the worst in us to come out. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that fear, quote, crouches in people's hearts. It hollows out their insides until their resistance and strength are spent, and they suddenly break down. Fear secretly gnaws and eats away at all the ties that bind a person to God and to others, rendering them helpless and despairing, all while hell rejoices, end quote. What Bonhoeffer is saying is that fear is not what causes hell to rejoice. It's how we respond to fear that can cause hell to rejoice. Fear. What are you most afraid of? How does fear play a role in your life? How does fear play a role in how you treat people, especially those who are different from you? Are you responding to these fears in a way that causes hell to rejoice? How are you responding to your fear? If you are older than 15 years old, you know the fear that resulted from the evil and tragic events of September 11th, 2001. Most of us watched in horror from television sets where virtually every channel was glued to the carnage of that day. Fewer of us have been in New York, Pennsylvania, or Washington, D.C. that day. Some of us may even know someone who was on the scene or who perished. People near the scene felt fear like they never had before. They had to run away or may have even frozen in place. I met a man last year in our grief support group who was still grieving after being on an upper floor of the South Tower of the World Trade Center and witnessed much of the carnage firsthand. He lost many friends and colleagues that day. He remembers going down the stairs, the smoke, the fear on the faces of those with him. Those are things he will never forget. He knows a lot about fear. Consider the fact that while people were feverishly running away from the terror, there were brave men and women going the opposite direction into the horror. Did they have fear? Of course they did. Did they let fear cripple them? No. They are brave and courageous because in spite of the fear they felt, they chose to walk right into the valley of the shadow of death, not for themselves, but for others. They are sheroes and heroes. None of us will ever forget that day. It was a day of great terror and of great fear. People who claimed to be people of God did something contrary to what God represents. I know who they claimed to be, but who they really were was a death squad of heartless, faithless, graceless, and loveless individuals looking to kill anyone and anything contrary to them. They were willing to kill Americans and non-Americans. They were willing to kill Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, atheists, agnostics, and probably devil worshipers too. They were willing to kill men, women, people who were white, black, Latino, Asian, African, European, straight, gay, transgender, physically challenged, able-bodied, mentally challenged, old, young, rich, poor, and in between. I know no faith tradition which supports all of this. These individuals were a breed of their own. They sought only to bring as much fear as possible in hopes that we would do as Bonhoeffer says happens, that we would break down. It was the aim of those members of a death squad who sought to silence the freedom that rings from this nation. They sought to silence the hopes and dreams of people in America and beyond. They sought to use fear to get us to move away from our principles. Instead of that, it became a lesson to the entire world that in times of terror and fear, America stands to the challenge and walks in the direction of the fear that seeks to chain us, and we refuse to be bullied. America refuses to renege on its ideals, the ideals rooted in our belief that all people are created equal and that all have the unalienable and God-given rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideals remain even in the midst of terror and fear. Remember, fear is an emotion. It can make us feel, but it cannot make us act. The challenge for us now is to respond in a way that does not come from fear, but comes from faith. Fear gives us chains, but faith grants us freedom. We are free to live, free to hope, free to dream, free to be generous, free to be you, free to be me. We are free to worship or not worship. We are free to stand or kneel or be stuck between the two. That's who we are, and we shall not budge from that, not as Americans and not as Christians. The theme for the day is the sound of freedom. What does freedom sound like? Freedom sounds like what we heard on September the 12th, 2001. We heard men and women working. We heard people going to work and to school. We heard people standing up to the fear and refusing to be chained. The sound of freedom is the sound of the chains of fear falling to the ground. We hear the sound of freedom when the people rally together to heal, to rebuild, to remember, to pray, and to continue to love and respect one another. That's the sound of freedom. We hear the sound of freedom when we see people embrace those who are different from them, who do not agree with them, who do not believe like them, who do not look like them, who do not worship like them. We hear the sound of freedom when people of every faith tradition are free to live, work, play, and worship without need to be concerned about their safety or that they are being mistreated. We need to look no farther than our own city to see that we have work to do in this department. There's a mosque in Johns Creek called Masjid Jafar. I've met with the leaders of that mosque several times over the past year. They are wonderful people. They are wonderful Americans. They work hard. They have loving families. They go to school with my children and yours. They are members of the same country clubs, shop in the same stores and shops. They've been renting a space to worship, and the landlord asked them to vacate that lease early. They've tried to honor the wishes of the landlord, but no other landlord in the city has been willing to rent to them. And this has been going on since November of last year. That's not American, and it's not Christian. It's a poor response to fear, causing us to renege on the ideals and principles that make us who we are. Somebody needs to do something about that. Some Christian needs to do something about that. The patriotic hymn, America the Beautiful, says it very well. America, America, God mend thine every flaw. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. We have work to do. How do we bring about the sound of freedom in this situation? We will hear the sound of freedom when this city welcomes the Muslim like it does the Methodist, the Baptist, the Catholic, and every other faith. And I can't wait to hear that sound. Jean Taff is sitting in the congregation today, and I received an email earlier this week that she had made contact with folks in the Muslim community and invited one to come to her house and some of her friends to be able to discuss and to share, to hope and to dream together. That is the sound of freedom, Jean. You must be a Christian. Behind me, we are installing an organ thought to be silenced on September 11th. This organ was used to play sounds that brought people hope, joy, and love. An organ used at weddings, funerals, baptisms, confirmations, communions, Christmas Eve, and Easter services. It was thought to be silenced. But the sound of freedom may lay dormant for a time, but it shall always be heard again. What does freedom sound like? It sounds like an organ being pulled from the ashes, thought to be destroyed. The dust and ashes are wiped away. It is resurrected from its dormancy, and it rises up before our eyes, and then it begins to play. What will it play? It will play our freedom songs. It plays the Old Irish Blessing. It plays Amazing Grace. It plays God of Grace and God of Glory. It plays Blessed Assurance. It plays the sounds of freedom. The sound of freedom will be heard from Johns Creek in a very unique way. While we continue to feel sorrow for the events of the past, we have a very real hope for the future. Why? Because the chains of fear and terrorism do fall. They fall when we stand together and refuse to become controlled by fear. Instead, we control it. That's the gospel, and that's the hope of America. That's the sound of freedom. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.